Welcome to the Past Precedent. I'm your host, Herodotus. It's the 32nd century BCE and history begins at Sumer. What's the date specifically? Unfortunately, there's not a specific date, but historians say that civilization began in Sumer sometime between 3500 and 3100 BCE. So why did I pick the 32nd century BCE? Well, if civilization began within that time frame, I picked the final century within that time frame to ensure that Sumer was indeed flourishing. And for our purposes of building an effective timeline, if you plug in history begins at Sumer, 32nd century BCE, you'll have your first date. Now, I say history begins at Sumer not only because it's true, but also because of the famous book by the same name. And before we discuss it, let's go back a bit further. In the Near East, the Neolithic Revolution, or Agricultural Revolution, happened sometime between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, and this means hunter-gatherers switched to farming and domesticating animals. From here, villages started to pop up, and with irrigation becoming more sophisticated and widespread, storing food became more common. Then sometime between 3500 and 3100 BCE, in Sumer, civilization began, because here is where villages grew into the first cities, which means there was extensive irrigation, massive food surpluses that could support up to 20,000 people, stable trade relations, ample manufacturing, an effective bureaucracy, a common culture, and the first written language. And Sumer was never a united nation. Rather, it was an area with a shared culture that consisted of about 20 separate city-states. And each was ruled by its own king, or ense, or lugal, and they would eventually fight each other over boundary disputes. The layout of these city-states, from edge to interior, was farmland that surrounded the city up to about 15 miles, that produced mostly wheat, barley, peas, lentils, dates, and figs, with goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle. Their homes were in the fields, made of mud bricks and reeds with no sewage. Close to the city, but outside the walls, we have a marketplace for trade. People traded for food, animals, land, weapons, tools, jewelry, and other decorations. Inside the walls, you have the royal family's palace, and in the center of the cities were these huge 10-story temples to the gods, which we call ziggurats. Sumerian society was a patriarchy with slaves at the bottom. Slaves were considered property and were either captured in war, born into it, sold into it by their creditors or parents, or they even sold themselves into it as a means of survival. Free people, on the other hand, worked for and under the protection of the king, and they paid their taxes with labor, food, or precious metals. Instead of using coins to pay taxes or trade, they used commodity money, which means anything that has value outside of being a unit of exchange, like barley. If you can't trade your barley, then at least you can eat it. So the idea of money was there. It just took a couple thousand years for humans to find the right unit of exchange that was more storable, durable, fungible, portable, and reliable. Standardization of coins of gold and silver were not invented until around 700 BCE in Asia Minor, where Turkey is today. Free men took control of agricultural duties and trade, while women worked closer to home, making things like cheese, yogurt, and clothes while raising children. Kings were at the top of the patriarchy and lived in lavish palaces that served as administration centers and treasure houses with a council of advisors. Kings acknowledged the gods as their rulers and gave the priests public influence. Their primary responsibility was to keep the gods happy, which means free from natural disasters and attacks from other cities. Writing was a skill mastered by a few at the top for administrative and religious purposes, and they created scribal schools to pass on this knowledge. And in turn, these schools expanded to mathematics, foreign language, and literature, and ultimately it preserved the Sumerian culture. Bronze was a new metal of choice at this time, and the wheel and the plow had just been invented. So that's Sumer in a nutshell, and I'll bring it up again because those Sumerians will be around for the next 1,000 years. I won't mention everything, of course, and that's okay. It'll be enough for the purposes of this project. Remember, we're building a foundation here, and the utility will come by connecting and memorizing all 53 anchor dates in every century of Western civilization first, then after that, we'll delve deeper. Well, first, as you've already noticed, exact dates are tricky this far back. As Professor Bauer put it in her book, The History of the Ancient World, dating anything that happened before Hammurabi around 1750 BCE is problematic. Even Hammurabi's ascension has an error factor of 50 years or so on either side. And by the time we go back as far as 7000 BCE, the error factor is closer to 500 or 600 years. So establishing exact dates will be a problem for the next millennium or two as we're building our timeline. But don't worry, your timeline will still be effective. It's best to have a stable date to reference, grounded in a source, but know that through discussing history with others, they may have different dates close to yours. From there, you can always take that next, deeper step into assessing how historians establish these dates, and then you can make up your own mind. The second reason why all this is important is that the Sumerian culture was the culture in Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years. And during that time, the Sumerians were eventually conquered, absorbed amongst other groups, and their language was replaced. But it was their culture that thrived and was built upon in other Mesopotamian cultures until the collapse of the Bronze Age around 1000 BCE. After that, the cultural foundation of the West was replaced by the classical Greeks, who flourished around the 5th century BCE. From that point, history began, and little was known of the Sumerian influence until the discoveries of the 19th century CE. It's only since then that historians have started connecting the dots from classical Greek culture to the previous Mesopotamian cultures, which of course began in Sumer. And a third and final reason why all this is important is just to know when prehistory transformed into history, to know what civilization was like when history began 5,000 years ago, to know that it was more sophisticated than most people realize. And once you have a sense of the Sumerian civilization, you'll have a solid starting point to track the human condition through any historic lens, like technology, economics, government, morality, gender relations, whatever. Then you can begin to intelligently calibrate how we have progressed, regressed, or stayed the same over time. It'll always be a piece of information that you'll never regret spending the time to understand. So that's it. Our first date, 32nd century BCE. History begins at Sumer. Only 52 dates to go. If you have any questions or know a lot already, in the comment section, please post anything you think is essential to understanding this century or this topic. If you're adding new information, please cite your sources. I'll be monitoring what's going on, and in my conclusion videos for this project, I'll highlight how we've expanded its historiography and list any questions that seem to be left unanswered. At that point, we'll have a stronger foundation for my next project and all future projects. And of course, if you're an expert and you want to share your knowledge to help guide us, please feel free to join the conversation. Or if you're interested, I'd love to interview you and post it right here. So contact me. If you just found me for the first time and are curious what this is all about, go check out my intro videos to both this project and this channel. And as always, subscribe, like, donate some money to keep this show going, click the notification so you know when the next video is up, and I'll see you then.